As WikiLeaks continues to feed media outlets with thousands of classified U.S. diplomatic cables, questions are being raised. Questions not only on the impact of the revelations themselves, but also on what effect they're having on mainstream media as well. So how serious is the threat by WikiLeaks to other media outlets? And how is WikiLeaks shaping the media industry? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abougaida. This is the second episode of our special on WikiLeaks on Inside Story. Well, among the latest leaked U.S. cables show the Roman Catholic Church refused to cooperate with an Irish probe into child sex abuse. Requests for information by the Murphy Commission are said to have offended many in the Vatican because they saw them as an affront to Vatican sovereignty. So, as the website continues to release more and more controversial cables and fights to remain online, many now are wondering if WikiLeaks is ushering in a new era of media. Now, that might not be a journalistic entity in itself, but a kind of investigative tool used by a traditional media outlet. Well, never before has a private organization provided multiple mainstream media with access to unprecedented classified government information. And this new strategy marks a shift not just for WikiLeaks, but for whistleblowing in general. It hints that modern information technology is shifting news leaks away from traditional media, such as newspapers. So, is this a new way of disseminating information? Well, that's what we're going to discuss with our guests. We're joined on this episode of Inside Story from Beirut, Robert Fisk, Middle East correspondent for the British newspaper The Independent. From Cairo, Wael Abbas, he's a journalist and a blogger. And in London, Adam Westbrook, a multimedia journalist. Gentlemen, welcome all to the program. Now, as we're saying, we'd like to step outside the WikiLeaks cable controversy for this edition of Inside Story and really see what WikiLeaks has done to the craft of journalism. Robert, if I can come to you first, you've written that you suspect a massive hoard of material referring to the Iraq war cables at the time of their release has serious implications for journalists. Elaborate, tell us how.
I think, in fact, there are going to be a huge amount of phenomenal effects on the journalistic industry. I'll give you an example. In the past, we had what we call investigative journalists who spent hours, days, sometimes months on a story and then came up with an exclusive and revealed what was in secret documents. All that's now gone out the window, apparently. What we have now are a vast number of journalists sitting in front of screens, watching this stuff slide down in front of them and blipping here and then choosing bits they want to print. There's no work involved. There's not a single investigative journalist, not a single journalistic investigation been involved in this, just sitting there letting it plonk in front of them. It's the laziest kind of journalism because, in fact, there's very little comment about the contents of those US cables. It's all, look, here's another one, look what they said in 1985 and look what they said then. Interestingly, it was that the journalists have done so little work on it that one of the documents highlighted by the New York Times, a comment by Bruce Langan, who was the consul in Iran just during the revolution and just afterwards, was originally released by Iranian students 30 years ago when they pasted together the bits of paper that had been shredded by the Americans. There it was, big headlines in the New York Times. No one had any kind of institutional memory that they'd written all this before. So I think it's a very sad day for journalism because, in fact, what appears to be happening, rather grimly, I'm afraid, is that a computer hacker who has a great sense of his own self-importance, by the look of it, has become the new journalist. I think it's a pretty astonishing thing to have happened, and I think it's a very frightening one for our craft.
We know now that there's another whistleblower called OpenLeaks that's set to launch on Monday, in fact. So let me just ask you, is whistleblowing the future of journalism?
Well, you see, the problem is that real whistleblowing should be the person from inside who has inside information and gets it out despite what the authorities want. What we've got is a totally, not unedited, I don't want to edit it, but we've got somebody else, this other whistleblower, for example, they're going to choose what we see and they're going to choose the order we see it in. That's exactly what happened with the New York Times and so on over the issue of the Iraq documents and the Iraq photographs and the Afghanistan papers. It's like it's put out bit by someone with apparently no real journalistic experience. but we have now become the dogs who eat the food and then dispense it, of course, to the viewers or the readers. And I find this not enough thought has gone into what we're doing with our craft by accepting it in this form. Having said that, of course, like everyone else, I need my WikiLeaks fix every morning. Sundays are very boring these days.
All right. Well, while Abbas in Cairo, was it only a matter of time, in your opinion, before these whistleblowers started to pop up after WikiLeaks?
Yeah, I think that this is a very good phenomena. We had something similar here in Egypt with police leaks. We had videos leaking out of police stations showing the police torturing suspects and ordinary citizens, not necessarily political activists. And when those videos leaked and were published on the internet, they created a huge debate in the Egyptian society about torture in the police stations. And actually one of the videos resulted in a trial, and some police officers were sent to jail because of them. So those videos wouldn't have had another way out to be aired on TV, or for example, or printed in a newspaper, but they found their way on the internet. So I think that this is a new phenomenon that we are facing here, and it's a good thing in my opinion.
Adam Westbrook in London, do you consider WikiLeaks and the likes as helping investigative journalism, or actually doing the job of investigative journalists?
Well, I think the point to make, as Robert's already said, WikiLeaks is not journalism. What WikiLeaks is a data dump. It's just a collection of vast amounts of these cables and other documents as well that have been kind of assimilated, put together, and then released in huge chunks. And I think, in a way, what the last kind of few days and the last few weeks, in fact, have shown is that there is still room for traditional journalism in a way, because these organisations that have worked alongside WikiLeaks, such as The Guardian and the New York Times, they still have had to fulfil the classic journalism role of distilling this information, working out what's important and what isn't, and deciding, and sort of compressing it down into a way that's digestible for the public. But I suppose to just add on to what Robert was also saying a bit earlier on, I think this could be, this could potentially be worrying for journalists, and I think it poses a lot of difficult questions for journalists and for journalism as a craft. But at the same time, journalism really only has itself to blame for this. The reason WikiLeaks is in this position, receiving this information and being able to disseminate it, is because it understands this new internet age that we're in. It gets how the internet works, and it gets how to make this happen. And newspapers have that opportunity, and have had that opportunity for many years to do that as well, but they've passed that by. So I think it's only natural that an organisation like WikiLeaks then comes to fill that gap. But it is worrying then that one of the most significant acts of journalism in the last few years has been carried out by someone who is not a journalist.
Okay, Robert Fisk, I saw you reacting there when Adam was talking out of London, and just like Adam was saying, we did see that whistleblowing sites can work hand in hand, in fact, with traditional media outlets. So isn't that considered to be a good thing? After all, the point is always to get information across to the public.
Yeah, but they're not working hand in hand. The begging bowl is held out by the journalists, and WikiLeaks provides it. The journalist just sits in front of a computer now, and all this stuff slops down in front of him. They're not working hand in hand. They're waiting to be fed. And it is WikiLeaks that's doing the feeding. I mean, I agree with Wael. I think it's basically a good thing. It's nice to see that the Americans, some of the diplomats actually seem to be quite literate, others clearly not. And I sometimes reading them, I feel that they should be read by psychiatrists as well as journalists. But I think it's a good thing in principle that we can now see the reality of, for example, some form of reality of US foreign policy in the Middle East. Historians will use these documents, be sure of that, long before they normally would after, a 30-year rule or whatever. And I think other governments must be worried now. I mean, the American isn't the only government in the world, although we sometimes seem to think so. But as for journalists, no, I think that we're flabbergasted at what we're seeing and reading, but we're not doing anything. We're not distilling it, in fact. We're just blumping it down in front of our readers every day or viewers or whatever. We find little, sexy bits here and there in it. We hear about, Gaddafi's voluptuous blonde. Blondes are always voluptuous, aren't they? But that's what the US cable said. But on the other hand, there must be much more serious things about Gaddafi, which we're not reading, because presumably it hasn't been released yet. So I think, there's also a question there. I noticed that we've had nothing really interesting about the Israeli government, except that their drones are very vulnerable on the South Lebanon border, which I'm sure the Hezbollah were happy to see. I think there's a good deal of controlling in this. It is WikiLeaks that say, oh, sure, they're going to release 250,000, and jolly good. As I say, I'm enjoying reading them. But we're not choosing them. WikiLeaks is choosing them. And WikiLeaks is choosing which government it's going to reveal the documents of. Is the British going to be next, or the French, or aren't they interested? It is people like Mr. Assange who are doing the decisions, and as you say, they are not journalists. We're not hand in hand with them. We're the begging bowl people. That's the problem.
Okay, well, where can we as journalists, we have to ask where we can add value to this process. So in the case of WikiLeaks logs, Wael, in your opinion, where do journalists add value?
Well, the value is that there's this concept of that information should be available to the people. And what WikiLeaks did is made some sensitive information and sensitive cables available to the public, which the government is hiding away from them. So if WikiLeaks started something like that, let's not say that WikiLeaks should expose documents about the Israeli government or the French or the British, but it's the responsibility of other activists, not necessarily journalists in those countries, to show us stuff that we need to know about those governments, about the Israeli government, about the British, about the Australian. So it can start a trend here, and it can encourage others to do the same, which is really needed.
Adam, are we allowing WikiLeaks and the likes to set the tone for the editorial policy for viewers or readers?
I think that's probably still to be seen in a way. I think it's important to point out that that WikiLeaks needs the mainstream media at the moment as much as the other way around. I think I think Julian Assange's decision to collaborate with a select number of newspapers was probably one of the most important decisions he made, or he's made so far in how WikiLeaks operates. Because I think without the New York Times and without Der Spiegel and without the Guardian and others, it would just be a data dump. It would just be thousands of files on a website that not that many people would have time to read. I mean, I certainly agree that it is concerning that we don't know that much about Julian Assange himself, or indeed the rest of the other people who are doing WikiLeaks. And I think he's him and the others are kind of putting themselves in this position of being these kind of great crusaders for the freedom of information. But there's still a lot about them we don't know. And I think I'd agree that journalists perhaps need to do some more digging as to who their sources are and how reliable the information that they're receiving is.
Robert, would you like to comment on what Adam had to say there?
Well, I think we're rather running on the same train here. Look, I don't think... I still don't know very much about Julian Assange, and I've been reading every article about him. I mean, we know the word rape comes into the accusations against him in Sweden, and that seems to be it. But the other thing I noticed was, when we were watching the coverage of his initial hearing where he was refused bail in London, it was very interesting that there was very little comment about that. For example, I'm sure that the justice was a man of immense probity, but one question I'd like to know, for example, and no journalist asked, is has the British government attempted to interfere in any way? Now, you may say, no, such a thing wouldn't happen, but WikiLeaks has already shown us that the British buckled down under American pressure and refused to hand documents to the Chilcot inquiry on the war in Iraq, which was set up by Parliament, a judicial inquiry. So are the British putting any pressures on here? I mean, nobody's been asking this question. And I asked myself, why not? It's interesting to see the way in which, for example, the dog-like way in which journalists are still buckling to the governments as well. Look, for example, at Madame Clinton's first press conference, or second press conference, in which she referred to the alleged documents. I mean, that's nonsense, of course. We all know that they're real. And then immediately afterwards, the BBC's correspondents suddenly started asking a question about the alleged documents, you know, falling into line straight away. It's amazing. I think journalists, by and large, you see, have very much themselves to blame for all this, and I think that probably Adam would agree that in the dog days when we could have started kicking up and being our own WikiLeaks, we were coming to heel with our lobby correspondents and our
that's what I wanted to ask you,
Robert.
That's what I wanted to ask you, Robert. Is the WikiLeaks cables a reflection of journalism, or the failure of journalism, if I can say that in any way?
Very much, yeah, very much the failure of journalism. I mean, I remember when the Iranians first released the documents, which of course they were paper in those days, which they found in the US Embassy after taking over. I remember virtually threatening having to resign from the London Times, which I was then working for, when I got copies of them and wanted to put them as a story. They were much more worried about the effect on national security in America than they were about telling the public what American policy had been in the first days and months of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. In a sense, though, I think there's one other thing we're not taking into account. These are documents that eventually would have become in the public domain 30 years' time, when, of course, historians would have read them and used them. What's different about this is we're getting them now, and some of them are almost real time. And if this goes on, and the Americans can't actually improve their encryption of their own documentation when it's floating around, we're pretty soon going to have a situation where we'll know today what the British ambassador or the American ambassador is saying in Beirut yesterday, and that will be pretty astonishing.
Let me just move over to Adam. Adam in London. I'll repeat that for you, something that Robert wrote. What is the point of sending teams of reporters to examine war crimes if almost 500,000 secret documents are going to float up on your screen? So let me pose that question to you.
Well, I think what we're starting to see here, and I think this is why WikiLeaks is potentially very interesting, is because it is, I think, really the first kind of sustained skirmish, if you like, between the new kind of internet age of you know, the freedom of information and complete and utter transparency, with, you know, the old way of doing things, both in diplomacy and in journalism as well. And I think you know, and I think this is going to be an ongoing sort of battle, if you like, not to, you know, to exaggerate it too much, that it's going to sort of unfold over, you know, the next 5 to 10 years and even beyond. So, but I think, you know, journalism is going to change, and how we do journalism is going to change. For example, there's a very interesting report that was just published very timely, in fact, this week by the Reuters Institute. It was written by Richard Sambrook who used to work at the BBC, and he was asking the question: is the foreign correspondent dead? You know, do we need the foreign correspondent anymore? And its conclusion pretty much said that, you know, the idea of you know, an old man wearing white trousers going from bar to bar and sort of talking to people and doing things that way and filing from his hotel room, you know, those days may well be numbered. But the idea that that we still have people in places who are doing proper reporting is still very much in need, and it will just be done differently, and it'll be done perhaps by different people, perhaps by younger people, perhaps even by people who are native to those countries. So I think the way journalism is going to be done is certainly going to change, but I don't think, I think it's, you know, perhaps a bit cynical to think that journalists are now just going to sort of retire and sit back and just let all this information wash up in front of their, on their computer screens.
Let me bring in Wael Abbas in here. Let me bring in Wael Abbas. Wael, you're a blogger based in Egypt. In your opinion, how much investigative work do modern journalists actually do?
Well, I believe that any good journalist is doing as much as he can to get the information and to complete the story he is reporting on. But the problem is, I have seen that even in the Western world, where there is a long tradition of freedom of journalism and freedom of expression, they still cannot reach all the information that they need, and they need to wait for documents to leak and stuff like that. But in countries like mine, and in the whole region in general, the regimes are oppressive to the media and to the journalists. They always hide the information. Information is not easy to reach, even if they were out on the street. Like if you are a reporter and you are out on the street and there is a demonstration and the police is beating the people, and you are taking video footage with your camera, you can get arrested for that, and you can get your camera smashed or your tape confiscated. And even if you go back to your studio, you cannot air it online. air it on your TV. There's a lot of censorship. There's a lot of interference.
Okay, so what lessons are to be learned from WikiLeaks, from these cables that have been released on established order and the culture of the internet?
The lesson is that people are hungry for information, and the only way to fulfill these desires of the people to know information is to find out other means of transmitting the information to them, whether it's through TV, printed newspapers, or the internet. You look for something that is not really controlled by the regime or the government that you are working under, and it will make it easier for you to reach people and disseminate the information that you want to them.
Robert Fisk, in terms of what's been released up until now, up until to date, should anything have remained unreported in your opinion? There's been a lot of talk about you know, this not being good for the government, etc. So what do you say to that?
Well, you see, I think, first of all, by the way, just going back on another point, one of the interesting things is that some of the US diplomats report a lot better to their State Department than American journalists report to their newspapers and television stations. That's one thing we ought to take note of, that some of these diplomats are better reporters than we are. Look, I think the real issue here is that we're told, for example, that the cable referring to possible terrorist targets, quote unquote, around the world is going to be of use to, quote, terrorists. I think they've already worked out what their targets would be. I don't think, you know, that while the Hezbollah will be interested on the references to the Israelis, they're not going to learn an awful lot from that, because the reality is that if you're on the ground in these different places, you pretty much know what's going on and what the facts are. Whether you can say them or not is a different issue, and that is a very important point. But I think that, you know, you can overdo this. I mean, Mrs. Clinton, La Clinton, coming on and saying this is an attack on the international community. You know, this from a woman who is supporting a war in Afghanistan that's killing dozens and dozens of people every week. It's absolute nonsense. It's not an attack on the international community. It's an attack in many cases upon the pomposity and the secret luminescent secret environment which diplomats have built for themselves. Why shouldn't we know what the American ambassador said last year? It's not nothing that's actually been said is actually extraordinary. That's the amazing thing. We do know most of it in some form. What we're getting is a much clearer picture of how the US sees it, of how sometimes the diplomats are sending back a form of reality that's something in touch with reality, and then the famous policy papers of which La Clinton constantly talks turn out to be the usual nonsense of threatening people in the Middle East, supporting dictatorships and groveling to the Israelis.
All right, Robert Fisk, thank you very much for your thoughts. And Wael Abbas out of Cairo, and Adam Westbrook as well from London. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time on Inside Story. And of course, we'd like to thank our viewers for joining us here on this edition. We welcome your comments and your suggestions as always. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.